I remember the exact moment it all fell apart. It wasn't some dramatic explosion, no shouting match, no plates shattering against the wall. Just one sentence tossed out casually like I didn't know it was loaded. My name's Claire, I'm 36, and honestly, I should have known better. I was sitting at the kitchen table, legs tucked under me, flipping through emails while the smell of burnt coffee lingered in the air. Mark was standing by the counter, hands fidgeting with the lid of the French press, his voice soft but insistent. "Do you want to do dinner with my parents this Friday?" It wasn't an unreasonable question. But I was already juggling a deadline at work, 2 social events I'd agreed to out of guilt, and a nagging feeling that I hadn't had a second to myself in weeks. I sighed, more out of exhaustion than irritation, but I knew how it would come across. "I don't know, Mark. Can we not schedule every second of my life?" His face shifted just a fraction, but enough that I noticed. He tightened the lid on the press with a little more force than necessary. "I just thought it might be nice. I should have left it there, should have said something conciliatory or at the very least neutral, but something inside me snapped. Maybe it was the weight of all the little obligations piling up, or maybe it was just my own selfishness bubbling to the surface. "You're just too needy sometimes, you know that?" I said it without looking up, my eyes still glued to the screen like I couldn't be bothered to give the moment any real attention. Silence. When I finally glanced up, he was staring at me, his expression unreadable. For a second I thought he might say something, push back, ask me to explain myself. But he didn't. He just nodded once like he was filing the information away somewhere deep inside. "Got it," he said quietly. Then he walked out of the kitchen. I went back to my emails, the weight of the conversation already fatting in my mind. I told myself it wasn't a big deal. We had plenty of moments like that before, little friction points that smoothed over with time. He was sensitive, sure, but he always bounced back, or at least that's what I thought. The change was subtle at first. He didn't stop talking to me or slam doors in passive-aggressive protest. But there was a quietness to him that hadn't been there before, like he was holding himself at arm's length. The goodnight kisses became quick pecks instead of lingering moments. The texts during the day, those sweet, thoughtful messages he always sent just to check in, grew shorter and less frequent. I told myself I was imagining it. Mark was probably just busy with work, or maybe he was giving me the space I clearly wanted. After all, wasn't that what I'd asked for? But as the days turned into weeks, the distance between us felt more tangible, like a physical barrier I couldn't quite breach. I found myself watching him more closely, searching for signs that everything was still okay. He still smiled at my jokes, still made my coffee in the morning, still asked how my day was. But there was a reserve in his eyes, a caution that hadn't been there before. It unsettled me in ways I didn't fully understand. One night, as we sat on the couch watching some forgettable show, I found myself glancing sideways at him. He was leaning back, his arms stretched along the back of the couch, but there was a stiffness to his posture. I wanted to say something to break through the strange tension that had settled between us, but I didn't know how to start. Instead, I reached for his hand, threading my fingers through his. He glanced down at our hands, then up at me, offering a small smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "You okay?" I asked, trying to keep my tone light. "Yeah, just tired." Tired. That word echoed in my mind long after we went to bed. Mark had always been the steady one in our relationship, the one who leaned in when things got hard, who never shied away from emotional conversations. I was the one who pulled back, who needed space to process my feelings. And he'd always given me that space, even when it hurt him. But now it felt like he was the one pulling away, and I didn't know how to bridge the gap. In the quiet darkness of our bedroom, I stared at the ceiling, my chest tight with a mix of guilt and fear. I replayed that moment in the kitchen over and over again, hearing my own voice cutting through the air, sharp, dismissive, careless, too needy. The words sounded uglier now, stripped of the defensive justifications I'd wrapped them in at the time. I wanted to believe that one comment couldn't unravel everything we'd built together, but deep down I knew better. Words had weight, and sometimes they lingered long after the moment had passed. Mark was still here, still present in the practical sense, but emotionally he felt miles away. And the terrifying part was I wasn't sure if I could pull him back or if he even wanted to be pulled back at all. The days stretched on, each one thick with a tension I couldn't shake. Mark's distance remained subtle but palpable, a quiet hum beneath the surface of our daily routine. It was the absence of things that hurt the most, the texts he didn't send, the casual touches he no longer initiated, the way his laughter seemed reserved now measured. I tried telling myself I was imagining it, that I was reading too much into the natural ebb and flow of a long-term relationship. But late at night, when sleep eluded me, I couldn't ignore the gnawing ache in my chest. One evening after dinner, I found myself staring at him across the table. His plate was mostly empty, the remnants of a half-hearted meal scattered across it. He was scrolling through his phone, his brow furrowed in concentration. "We never did reschedule dinner with your parents," I said, my voice unnaturally bright, like I was trying too hard to inject life into the conversation. He didn't look up right away, and when he finally did, his expression was unreadable. "No, we didn't," he said simply. I waited for him to suggest a new date to take the lead the way he usually did. But he just went back to his phone, leaving the silence between us heavy and awkward. Frustration prickled at my skin. I wanted to shake him to demand that he stop acting like some polite stranger. But the guilt lurking beneath my anger kept me silent. Instead, I cleared the plates, my movements sharp and deliberate, hoping he'd notice my agitation. He didn't. Or if he did, he chose not to acknowledge it. Later that night, as I stood at the sink scrubbing dishes with unnecessary force, I heard his footsteps behind me. "I'm going to head to bed," he said softly. I turned, the dishwater dripping from my hands. "Already? It's barely 9. "Yeah, I'm just tired," he said, echoing that word again. Tired. It was becoming his default answer, a shield he used to keep me at a distance. I wanted to call him out on it, to push past the polite facade and force a real conversation. But I hesitated, afraid of what might come out if I did. "Okay," I said instead, my voice quieter than I intended. He nodded and disappeared down the hallway, leaving me alone with the clinking sound of dishes and the hollow ache in my chest. The next morning, I woke up to an empty bed. Mark was already gone, a note on the kitchen counter telling me he had an early meeting. I stared at the neat, familiar handwriting, feeling a pang of longing for the days when his notes had been filled with little jokes or affectionate reminders. I spent the day trying to focus on work, but my thoughts kept circling back to him. By the time evening rolled around, I was determined to break the silence between us. When Mark walked through the door, his shoulders sagging with the weight of the day, I was waiting for him in the living room. "Hey," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Hey," he replied, dropping his bag by the door. "Can we talk?" He looked at me for a long moment, his expression guarded. "Sure, what's up?" I gestured for him to sit, and he did, though he kept a careful distance between us on the couch. "I feel like things have been off between us lately," I said, forcing myself to meet his gaze. "I don't know how to fix it, but I want to." Mark sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Claire, I'm not trying to punish you or make you feel bad. He paused, searching for the right words. "I guess I'm trying to respect what you said." "What I said," he nodded, "about being too needy." I winced, the words hitting me with fresh force. "Mark, I didn't mean it like that. I was just frustrated and I said something stupid." "I get that," he said quietly. "But it's not just about that one comment. It made me realize I've been leaning on you too much, and maybe that's not fair." His words cut through me, sharp and unexpected. "That's not true," I said quickly. "I need you too. I don't want you to pull away." He offered a small, sad smile. "I think you do, Claire. At least part of you does, and maybe I needed to hear that, even if it hurt." Panic rose in my chest, mingling with guilt. "No, that's not." I stopped myself, unsure how to untangle the mess of emotions swirling inside me. Mark's eyes softened, but there was a resolve in them I hadn't seen before. "Look, I love you. That hasn't changed. But I think we both need to figure out what we really want from this." I opened my mouth to argue, to convince him that everything could go back to normal if we just tried harder. But deep down, I knew he was right. The silence between us stretched long and heavy, filled with unspoken truths and lingering pain. I wanted to reach for him to bridge the gap between us, but fear and pride held me back. Mark stood up, his movements deliberate. "I'm going to take a shower," he said softly. I nodded, unable to find the right words to keep him there. As I watched him walk away, I felt the weight of everything I hadn't said pressing down on me. The walls I'd built to protect myself were now the very thing keeping us apart, and I didn't know how to tear them down. Alone in the quiet of the living room, I realized that the space I'd so desperately clung to was now suffocating me. And the person I needed most was slipping further and further out of reach. The next few days passed in a blur of forced normalcy. Mark and I operated like polite roommates, sharing the same space but existing in parallel worlds that rarely intersected. We spoke when necessary. "Do you need anything from the store?" Or "the trash pickup is delayed." But the warmth, the easy rhythm we once had was gone. I hated it. At first, I told myself to be patient, that it was just a phase, that Mark would snap out of whatever emotional retreat he'd slipped into. But as the days stretched into a week, then 2, I felt desperation gnawing at the edges of my resolve. One evening, I decided enough was enough. I walked into the bedroom where Mark was folding laundry, his movements methodical and precise. "Can we talk?" I asked, my voice tighter than I intended. He didn't look up right away, folding the last shirt before placing it neatly in the drawer. Then he turned to face me, leaning back against the dresser with crossed arms. "Sure," he said evenly. I hesitated, suddenly unsure of how to begin. I'd spent so much time replaying our last conversation in my mind, imagining all the things I should have said, but now that I had the chance, the words felt tangled and heavy in my throat. I hate how things have been between us," I finally admitted. "It feels like we're strangers." Mark's expression didn't waver. "I know. I'm sorry," I said, the words slipping out before I could second-guess them. For what I said was mean and thoughtless, and I didn't mean it. His eyes softened, but there was still a distance in them that made my chest ache. "I appreciate that," he said quietly. "But it's not just about that one moment, Claire, it's about how we got there in the first place." I frowned, confused. "What do you mean?" he sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I guess I started thinking about how much I've leaned on you over the years and how maybe that's not what you want or need." That's not fair, I protested. You're my husband, we're supposed to lean on each other. I know, he said gently, but I think I made the mistake of putting too much of my emotional weight on you, expecting you to be everything for me. And I guess hearing you say that I was too needy made me realize I need to figure out how to stand on my own a little more. His words left me reeling. This wasn't what I wanted. I wanted him back, fully present, not this careful, measured version of himself that felt like a stranger. I never wanted that, I said, my voice cracking. I never wanted you to pull away from me. Mark's gaze was steady, but I think part of you did, maybe without even realizing it. The truth of his words hit me like a punch to the gut. He wasn't entirely wrong. There had been moments when his attentiveness had felt overwhelming, when I'd wished for more space, more room to breathe. But now that I had it, I felt like I was suffocating. I miss you, I whispered, my voice breaking under the weight of the admission. I miss us too, he said softly, but I think we both need to figure out how to be okay on our own before we can be okay together. His words terrified me. The idea of stepping back, of not clinging to each other for stability, felt like a chasm I wasn't sure I could cross. What does that mean? I asked, my throat tight. It means I love you, he said firmly, and I'm not going anywhere. But I need to find my own footing, and maybe you do too. The silence that followed was heavy with uncertainty. I wanted to argue, to fight for the version of us that existed before my careless words had created this rift. But deep down, I knew Mark was right. We'd both lost pieces of ourselves along the way, and if we didn't find them again, we'd keep circling back to the same place. I don't know how to do that, I admitted, the vulnerability raw in my voice. Neither do I, he said. But I think we owe it to ourselves to try. Tears stung my eyes, but I blinked them back, unwilling to let the weight of this moment break me completely. Mark reached for my hand, his touch warm and familiar. We're not broken, Claire, we're just figuring things out. I nodded, though my heart still ached with the fear of what lay ahead. As Mark squeezed my hand, I clung to the hope that maybe, just maybe, we could find our way back to each other. But for now, all I could do was take the first uncertain step toward healing, even if it meant standing on my own for a while. The following weeks felt strange and fragile, like walking on thin ice with no clear path ahead. Mark and I moved through the same routines, making coffee, grocery runs, the occasional dinner, but there was a quietness between us that hadn't existed before. It wasn't the sharp, cold silence of anger, but something softer, more deliberate, as though we were both holding our breath, unsure of what came next. I told myself to give him space, that it was what he needed, and maybe what I needed too, but it wasn't easy. There were moments when I wanted to reach out, to pull him back into the comfortable rhythms we'd once shared. But I stopped myself, unsure if that would help or only push him further away. One Saturday afternoon, I found myself wandering aimlessly through the aisles of a bookstore, desperate for a distraction. The scent of paper and coffee hung in the air, soothing in its familiarity. I traced my fingers along the spines of books, my mind elsewhere, replaying fragments of conversations with Mark that I couldn't seem to let go of. I picked up a novel at random, flipping through the pages without really seeing the words. My phone buzzed in my pocket, and I pulled it out, half hoping it was Mark. It was a text from Emma, my best friend since college. "Wanna grab coffee? You've been MIA." I stared at the screen for a moment, debating whether I had the energy to explain everything or if I should just make an excuse. But Emma knew me too well for that. Sure. Give me 20 minutes. We met at a small cafe a few blocks away, the kind of place with mismatched chairs and baristas who wore vintage band tees. Emma was already at a table by the window when I arrived, her dark curls piled on top of her head and a latte cradled in her hands. "Hey, stranger," she said with a smile, though her eyes were laced with concern. "Hey," I said, sliding into the seat across from her. "You look like you've been through it," she observed bluntly. I let out a hollow laugh. "That obvious, huh? Always, what's going on?" I hesitated, unsure where to begin. Emma had seen me through breakups, career meltdowns, and every awkward stage of my 20s, but this felt different, messier, and harder to articulate. "It's Mark," I said finally. She raised an eyebrow. "Trouble in paradise," I sighed, wrapping my hands around my mug. "I said something stupid, really stupid, and now things are weird between us." Emma leaned forward, her expression serious now. "Define stupid." I took a deep breath, the words tasting bitter on my tongue. "I told him he was too needy." Her eyes widened. "Yikes. Yeah, I didn't mean it the way it came out, but it doesn't matter. He heard it and now he's pulled back, like way back, and I don't know how to fix it." Emma was quiet for a moment, sipping her latte thoughtfully. "Okay, first of all, people say dumb stuff in relationships all the time. It doesn't mean you're doomed." "I know, but it's not just about the one comment. He said it made him realize he's been leaning on me too much and that he needs to figure out how to stand on his own. Whatever that means." Emma frowned. "So he's doing the whole introspective, I need to find myself thing?" "Pretty much," she nodded slowly. "Look, I get that it's scary, but maybe it's not the worst thing. Sometimes space can be good. It forces you to figure out what you really want." I bit my lip, her words stirring something uncomfortable inside me. "What if he decides he doesn't want me anymore?" Emma reached across the table, squeezing my hand. Claire, anyone who spent 5 minutes with you and Mark can see how much he loves you. This isn't about him not wanting you, it's about him wanting to be the best version of himself for you. That's not a bad thing. Her words hit me harder than I expected, tears stinging my eyes. I blinked them back, refusing to cry in the middle of a cafe. God, I hate this, I muttered. I know, Emma said gently, but you're stronger than you think, and so is your relationship. I wanted to believe her, but doubt lingered in the corners of my mind. Later that evening back home, I found Mark in the living room, a book open on his lap. He looked up as I entered, offering a small smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Hey, I said, hovering near the doorway. Hey, he replied. I hesitated, then took a deep breath. Can I sit? Of course. I sank into the chair across from him, the weight of the day pressing down on me. I saw Emma today, I said, testing the waters. How is she? She's good, she thinks we'll be okay. Mark's expression softened. I think so too. The simplicity of his words made my chest tight. I'm trying, I said quietly. I know, me too. We sat there in the stillness, the air between us filled with unspoken promises and tentative hope. It wasn't a resolution, but it was a step. A fragile, uncertain step toward something better. And for now, that had to be enough. The air between Mark and me remained tentative, balanced on a fragile thread that neither of us dared pull too hard. There were glimmers of normalcy, small moments that felt like flickers of what we used to be. He'd brush his hand against mine when reaching for the same dish, and I'd catch myself laughing at one of his dry jokes. But those moments were fleeting, scattered amidst the long silences that still lingered. I told myself not to push, that giving space meant trusting the process even if it terrified me. But patience wasn't my strong suit. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the living room in shades of gold and shadow, I sat on the couch scrolling aimlessly through social media. Mark was in the kitchen, his quiet movements barely audible. The weight of the unspoken hung between us, and I couldn't bear it any longer. Mark, I called out, my voice cutting through the quiet. Yeah, he answered, poking his head around the corner. Can we talk? There was a brief hesitation before he nodded. He joined me on the couch, sitting at a respectful distance, his expression open but cautious. What's on your mind? He asked. I took a steadying breath, my fingers twisting together in my lap. I've been thinking a lot about what you said, that we both need to figure out how to be okay on our own. He nodded, his gaze steady but unreadable. And I get it, I continued. I really do, but it's hard. I miss us, Mark. I miss you. His shoulders softened slightly. I miss you too, Claire. Then why does it feel like you're still so far away? I asked, my voice breaking under the weight of the question. Mark exhaled slowly, as though he'd been carrying that same question inside himself. It's not about wanting to be distant. I guess I'm just trying to make sure I don't fall back into old patterns, leaning on you too much, expecting you to be my everything. You were never too much for me, I said fiercely. He met my gaze, his eyes filled with something raw and vulnerable. Maybe not for you, but I didn't like who I was becoming. I wasn't showing up for myself, Claire, and that's not fair to either of us. I swallowed hard, my throat tight. I never wanted you to change who you are. I don't even know what I wanted in that moment when I said it. I was frustrated and I took it out on you. I wish I could take it back. Mark reached for my hand, his touch warm and grounding. We can't change what's already been said, but we can figure out how to move forward. I clung to his hand, desperate for the connection. How do we do that? By being honest, he said simply, even when it's hard. And by giving each other the space to grow without growing apart. The words landed heavily, their truth undeniable. I wanted to promise that I'd be better, that I'd never let my insecurities or frustrations hurt him again. But I knew better than to make promises I couldn't keep. Relationships weren't about perfection, they were about showing up, flaws and all. I'm scared, I admitted softly. Me too, he said, but I think that's okay. As long as we keep talking, keep trying. Silence settled between us, but this time it felt different, softer, less weighted by uncertainty. Mark shifted closer, his arm brushing against mine. I love you, Claire, that's the one thing that hasn't changed. Tears stung my eyes, but I didn't fight them this time. I love you too. We sat there for a long time, the fading light casting shadows across the room. It wasn't a perfect resolution, there were still cracks and questions that needed tending, but it was enough for now. And maybe, just maybe, that was the first step toward healing. The following morning, sunlight streamed through the windows, painting golden streaks across the hardwood floor. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, Mark's steady breathing beside me. The conversation from the night before lingered in my mind, a tentative truce, a fragile understanding that didn't erase the past but gave us permission to move forward. I turned my head to look at him. His face was soft in sleep, the faint lines of worry smoothed away. There was a time when seeing him like this filled me with peace. Now it stirred something more complicated, a mix of tenderness and uncertainty. I slipped quietly out of bed, careful not to wake him, and padded into the kitchen. The air smelled faintly of coffee grounds from the night before. I filled the kettle and leaned against the counter as I waited for the water to boil, my thoughts swirling. What did moving forward even look like for us? How did I learn to give him space without feeling like I was losing him entirely? And how did I reconcile the part of me that wanted to hold on to him tightly, to demand reassurance that everything would be okay? The kettle whistled, snapping me out of my thoughts. I poured the water over the coffee grounds and watched as the rich, dark liquid filled the carafe. The simple ritual grounded me, offering a brief respite from the chaos in my mind. As I stood there sipping my coffee, Mark wandered into the kitchen, his hair tousled from sleep. He rubbed the back of his neck, offering me a sleepy smile. "Morning," he said, his voice rough. "Morning," I replied, my heart fluttering at the familiar warmth in his gaze. He reached for a mug and we stood side by side in comfortable silence for a moment, the weight of the past weeks hanging lightly between us. "I was thinking," he said finally, breaking the quiet, "maybe we should do something different today." "Get out of the house." Surprise flickered through me. "Like what?" "I don't know, a hike maybe, we used to love that." I blinked, caught off guard by the suggestion. It had been months since we'd done anything spontaneous together. "Yeah, okay, that sounds nice." An hour later, we found ourselves on a winding trail just outside the city. The air was crisp, carrying the earthy scent of pine and damp leaves. Birds flitted through the trees, their songs breaking the stillness. We walked in companionable silence at first, the only sound the crunch of leaves beneath our feet. My thoughts drifted to the early days of our relationship, when hikes like this had been our escape from the noise of the world. Back then, everything had felt easy, uncomplicated. "I forgot how peaceful this is," I said, my voice soft. Mark glanced at me, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Yeah, me too." We reached a clearing with a view that stretched for miles, rolling hills blanketed in trees, their leaves tinged with the first hints of autumn. The sight was breathtaking, a reminder of how small our troubles were in the grand scheme of things. Mark sat on a large rock, patting the spot beside him. I joined him, the cool stone grounding beneath me. "I've been thinking a lot," he said, his tone contemplative. "About what?" I asked, bracing myself. "About us. About what you said that day." I looked down at my hands, guilt prickling at my skin. "I was awful, Mark. I didn't mean it the way it came out, but that doesn't excuse it." He shook his head. "You weren't awful, you were honest, even if it hurt, and maybe I needed to hear it." I frowned, confused. "How can you say that?" "Because it made me realize something I hadn't been willing to face. I was relying on you in ways that weren't fair, and that wasn't good for either of us." His words settled heavily between us. "I never wanted you to feel like you couldn't lean on me," I said quietly. "I know," he said gently, "and I'll always need you, Claire, but I think I need to learn how to carry my own weight too. That doesn't mean I'm pulling away from you, it just means I'm trying to be better for both of us." Emotion welled up in my chest, raw and overwhelming. "I just want us to be okay. We will be," he promised. "It's just going to take time." I nodded, the truth of his words settling into my bones. Relationships weren't about never faltering, they were about finding your way back to each other when you did. As we sat there watching the world stretch out before us, I felt the first glimmer of something I hadn't felt in weeks: hope. It wasn't a resolution, but it was a beginning. And for now, that was enough. The days that followed were a delicate dance, a series of quiet steps as Mark and I navigated this unfamiliar territory. We were careful with each other, like two people learning a new language, trying not to trip over words that had once come effortlessly. I found myself hyper-aware of every interaction, second-guessing my impulses. Was I being too distant? Too attentive? Was I giving him enough room? The questions buzzed in my mind like a relentless swarm, and I hated how uncertain I felt in my own marriage. One evening, as I was chopping vegetables for dinner, Mark came into the kitchen, leaning casually against the counter. There was an ease in his posture that I hadn't seen in a while, and it gave me hope. "Need any help?" he offered. "Sure," I said, handing him a cutting board and a knife. "You can chop the peppers." We worked side by side in comfortable silence, the rhythmic chop of the knives filling the space between us. It felt almost normal, and I clung to that feeling like a lifeline. As I reached for a bowl to toss the vegetables in, Mark spoke up. "I was thinking about taking that woodworking class I mentioned a while back." I paused, surprised. "Really? That's great." He shrugged, a small smile tugging at his lips. "Figured it's time I do something for myself, something I've always wanted to try." "That sounds amazing, Mark. You'll be great at it." His smile widened, and for a moment I saw the man I'd fallen in love with, the one who was passionate and curious, always eager to learn something new. "What about you?" he asked, his tone gentle. "What's something you've been wanting to do?" The question caught me off guard. I opened my mouth to respond, but nothing came out. When was the last time I'd thought about what I wanted outside of our relationship or my work? "I don't know," I admitted, a bit embarrassed. "I guess I haven't really thought about it." "Well, maybe it's time you do," he said softly. Later that night, long after the dishes were washed and the house had fallen quiet, I sat alone on the couch, Mark already asleep upstairs. His question echoed in my mind, persistent and unyielding. What did I want? The truth was, I'd spent so much time trying to hold everything together, our marriage, my job, the expectations I placed on myself, that I'd lost sight of my own desires. I thought back to the things that used to light me up, painting on Sunday afternoons, losing myself in the swirl of colors and textures. I hadn't picked up a brush in years. Life had gotten in the way, as it often did, and I'd let that part of myself fade into the background. The realization hit me hard. I didn't just want our relationship to heal, I wanted to heal too. I wanted to reconnect with the pieces of myself I'd forgot, to find joy in the simple things again. The next morning, I woke up with a sense of resolve. After breakfast, while Mark was reading the news at the kitchen table, I cleared my throat. "Hey," I said, my voice steady, "I think I'm going to sign up for a painting class." He looked up, surprise flickering across his face before it softened into something warmer. "That's amazing, Claire. I didn't know you were thinking about that." "I wasn't," I admitted, "but I realized I miss it. I used to love painting, and I think I need that back in my life." Mark reached for my hand across the table, his thumb brushing against my skin. "I'm proud of you," he said simply. The words sank into me, filling a space I hadn't realized was empty. As the days turned into weeks, Mark and I found our rhythm again, not by returning to who we had been, but by learning who we were becoming. He threw himself into woodworking, his eyes lighting up when he talked about his latest project. And I rediscovered the joy of painting, the act of creating something from nothing, grounding me in a way I hadn't expected. There were still moments of doubt, of course. Healing wasn't a straight line, and there were times when I wondered if we'd ever fully mend the cracks. But those moments were fewer and farther between, overshadowed by the quiet strength we were building together. One afternoon, as I stood in my makeshift studio, brush in hand and paint streaked across my arms, Mark walked in, a grin on his face. "Wow," he said, taking in the canvas. "That's incredible." I laughed, self-conscious. "It's a work in progress." "Like us," he said, his voice warm. I set the brush down, meeting his gaze. "Yeah, like us." And for the first time in a long while, I believed it. We were still a work in progress, but we were moving forward together, and that was enough. There was a quiet peace settling between us, fragile but present. It didn't come from pretending the past hadn't happened or sweeping everything under the rug. It came from learning how to exist side by side without suffocating each other. Mark's woodworking projects began taking up a corner of the garage, sawdust dusting the floor like freshly fallen snow. I often heard the rhythmic hum of power tools and the occasional curse when something didn't go as planned. It was a good sound, a sign of life filling spaces that had once felt hollow. My own journey back to painting was messier, more tentative. There were moments when I stood in front of the canvas, paralyzed by doubt, afraid that whatever I created wouldn't be good enough. But I kept showing up, brush in hand, pushing through the discomfort. One evening, as twilight painted the sky in hues of orange and purple, I found myself lost in a swirl of blues and greens, the colors blending and clashing in unpredictable ways. My hair was pulled into a messy bun, stray tendrils sticking to my face where sweat had gathered. Mark appeared in the doorway, leaning casually against the frame. "Hey," he said softly. I looked up, startled. "Hey, dinner's ready, thought you might be hungry." I glanced at the time, surprised by how late it had got. "Wow, I didn't realize." He smiled, his gaze drifting to the canvas. "That's beautiful, Claire." "It's not finished," I said, wiping my hands on a rag. "Doesn't matter, I can see you in it." The words caught me off guard, striking a chord deep within me. "Thank you," I said, my voice thick with emotion. We sat down to eat together, the simple meal he'd prepared filling the space between us. There was something intimate about sharing these quiet moments, unburdened by the weight of expectations. After dinner, as we lingered at the table, Mark spoke up. "You know, I've been thinking about us a lot lately." I tensed, old habits hard to break. "Yeah, I think we've come a long way," he said thoughtfully. "But I also think we need to keep talking, keep being honest with each other." I nodded, my heart beating a little faster. "I agree." He reached for my hand, his grip warm and steady. "I don't want to go back to how things were before, I want something better." Tears stung my eyes, but I blinked them back. "Me too, Mark, I want us to be stronger, not just okay." "We will be," he promised. "As long as we keep choosing each other." The simplicity of his words carried profound weight. Love wasn't just a feeling, it was a choice, a series of decisions made every day to show up, to forgive, to try again. Later that night, as we lay in bed, Mark's hand resting lightly on mine, I felt a sense of quiet certainty. The road ahead wouldn't be perfect, but it would be ours. And for the first time in a long while, I felt ready to walk it step by step with him. The days stretched into weeks, and life settled into a rhythm that felt both familiar and new. There were no grand declarations or sweeping changes, just small, steady steps forward. Mark and I were learning how to exist together without leaning too heavily on the past or each other's insecurities. It wasn't perfect, far from it. There were moments when old patterns threatened to resurface, tension creeping into our conversations without warning. But we were more aware now, more willing to catch ourselves before things spiraled. One Saturday afternoon, I stood in front of my easel, the smell of turpentine sharp in the air. The canvas was a riot of colors, bold strokes of crimson and gold clashing against softer hues of blue and violet. I'd stopped trying to control the outcome, letting the brush guide me instead. It was messy, chaotic, and unapologetically mine. Mark's voice drifted in from the garage, a low hum punctuated by the whir of his tools. The sound was comforting, a reminder that we were both finding our way back to ourselves. As I added the final strokes to the painting, a knock at the door pulled me from my reverie. I wiped my hands on a rag and went to answer it, surprised to see my best friend Emma standing on the porch. "Hey," she said, her smile wide. "Thought I'd stop by and see if you were up for a coffee run." I grinned. "Absolutely, let me grab my keys." We ended up at a cozy cafe downtown, the scent of freshly brewed coffee wrapping around us like a warm hug. Emma took a sip of her latte, her eyes sparkling with curiosity. "So," she said, leaning forward, "how are things with Mark?" I hesitated, unsure how to put everything into words. "Better," I said finally. "We're still figuring things out, but it feels hopeful." Emma's smile softened. "That's good to hear. I was worried about you, you know." "I was worried about me too," I admitted. "There were moments when I didn't think we'd make it, but we're learning how to show up for each other without losing ourselves." She nodded thoughtfully. "That's the trick, isn't it? Finding that balance." "Yeah," I said, my voice quiet. "It's not easy, but it's worth it." As we chatted, I realized how much I'd missed these moments, simple conversations with someone who knew me inside and out. Emma had been my rock through the toughest times, always ready to listen without judgment. When we returned to the house, Mark was in the backyard, sanding down a wooden bench he'd been working on. He looked up as we approached, a smile spreading across his face. "Hey, Emma," he greeted warmly. "Hey, Mark," she said, her tone teasing. "Nice to see you doing something other than staring at spreadsheets." He laughed, brushing sawdust from his hands. "Yeah, this is a nice change of pace." Emma gave me a knowing look before heading to her car. "See you later, Claire, don't be a stranger." As she drove away, Mark turned to me, his expression thoughtful. "She's good for you," he said. "She is," I agreed. "So are you." His eyes softened, and for a moment everything else faded away. That night, as we sat on the back porch, the cool breeze rustling through the trees, Mark reached for my hand. "I've been thinking," he said, his voice steady. "Maybe we should take a trip, just the two of us." "Really?" I asked, surprised. "Yeah," he said. "We could use a change of scenery, don't you think?" A smile tugged at my lips. "I'd love that." We sat there talking about possible destinations and imagining the adventures we might have. It wasn't just about the trip, it was about choosing to invest in each other, to create new memories that would strengthen the foundation we were rebuilding. As the stars blinked to life above us, I felt a sense of gratitude wash over me. We weren't perfect, and we never would be. But we were trying, and that was enough. In the quiet of the night, I realized something profound. Love wasn't about never faltering. It was about finding your way back to each other again and again. And as long as we kept choosing each other, we'd be okay. The trip came sooner than I expected. After weeks of planning, Mark and I packed our bags, leaving the house behind for a weekend getaway to a small coastal town we once visited during the early days of our relationship. It felt like the right place to revisit, peaceful, quiet, and full of memories that at the time had seemed so simple, so pure. We drove for hours, the landscape shifting from the hustle and bustle of the city to the calm of rolling hills and eventually, the soft murmur of the ocean in the distance. As we pulled into the little inn by the beach, the familiar smell of salt air filled my lungs, and for the first time in a long time I felt myself breathe deeply. I looked over at Mark, who had been quiet for most of the drive. He was lost in thought, his hands on the wheel steady but distant. "Are you okay?" I asked, the concern bubbling up before I could stop it. He glanced over at me, his expression unreadable. "Yeah, just thinking," I nodded, unsure if I should press him further. Sometimes I wondered how much of me he was still sharing, how much of the distance between us was self-imposed. It was a feeling I hadn't quite shaken, the sense that I was living in a version of our life where some parts of him still felt unreachable. We settled into our room, unpacking in comfortable silence. The room had large windows that overlooked the beach, and I felt the pull of the ocean even from inside. I could already hear the rhythmic sound of the waves crashing against the shore, and it felt like an invitation to let go of everything we'd been carrying. "Want to go for a walk?" Mark asked, his voice suddenly lighter. I smiled, grateful for the shift in his tone. "Yeah, I'd love to." We walked along the beach, the sand cool beneath our feet. The sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange. It felt like the world was slowing down, taking its time as we did the same. As we strolled, the distance between us seemed to shrink. We weren't perfect, but we were here together, trying, and maybe that was enough for now. "I missed this," I said quietly, my gaze fixed on the waves as they lapped against the shore. "I missed us." Mark glanced at me, his face softening. "Me too, Claire, me too." We continued walking, side by side, not needing to say much more. The ocean stretched out before us, vast and infinite, reminding me that there was so much more to discover, not just about the world, but about each other. That night, after a quiet dinner at a little seafood restaurant, we sat on the balcony of our room, the stars sparkling above us. We didn't talk much, but there was a sense of contentment between us, a peace that had been hard to find in the chaos of our lives. Mark reached for my hand, his fingers intertwining with mine. For the first time in months, I felt like we were in sync again, like the hurt and uncertainty of the past had been washed away by the ocean breeze. I don't know what the future holds for us, Claire, Mark said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. But I know I want to face it with you. Tears stung my eyes and I squeezed his hand tightly. I want that too, Mark. I want us to figure it out together. The moment felt heavy with unspoken promises, and for once I didn't feel the need to rush. We had time, we had each other. The rest of the weekend passed in a haze of slow mornings and peaceful afternoons. It was a break from the whirlwind of life, a moment to reconnect with what truly mattered. When we packed our bags to head back home, I felt a quiet sense of renewal. We weren't fixed, we were still in the process of healing. But that was okay. The road ahead wasn't smooth, but I knew now that we had the strength to face whatever came next. As we drove back, the sun shining through the windshield, I glanced over at Mark. His eyes were focused on the road, but there was a softness in the lines of his face that hadn't been there before. I reached over, placing my hand on his. He looked at me briefly, a smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "Where do we go from here?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Squeezed my hand, his gaze steady on the road ahead. "We keep moving forward," he said simply. "One step at a time." And in that moment, I realized he was right. We didn't need to have it all figured out. As long as we kept walking together, we would find our way. We returned home from the trip with a quiet sense of clarity, but also a lingering undercurrent of uncertainty. There were no magical fixes, no immediate solutions to the gaps we'd both been so acutely aware of for months. But there was a shift, something subtle but real. We were learning how to navigate the spaces between us, even the uncomfortable ones, without running away. Life resumed its usual pace. Work, chores, responsibilities, they didn't stop just because we'd taken a weekend to breathe. But now there was something different in the way we approached the mundane. Every interaction with Mark, every look, every touch felt a little more intentional, a little more mindful. It was as if we were both giving each other permission to be vulnerable, to exist outside of the roles we had come to expect from one another. I kept painting. Some days the colors came easily, other days it felt like I was fighting with the canvas. But I kept at it, and slowly something began to shift within me. I wasn't just painting to fill a void. I was creating for myself, and in doing so, I was rediscovering parts of me that had long been buried. There was a quiet strength in the act of creation, an unspoken affirmation that I mattered, that I was enough even if my art wasn't perfect. Mark threw himself into his woodworking. I'd see him in the garage late into the evening, hands rough from sanding, eyes focused as he worked on his latest project. It wasn't just about the craft for him, it was a way to express himself, to give shape to the chaos of his thoughts and emotions. And somehow, in his quiet moments of concentration, I saw the man I had fallen in love with all over again. The one who didn't need to say much but whose actions spoke volumes. The distance between us had narrowed, but it wasn't gone. There were days when we stumbled, when old patterns surfaced, or when the weight of unspoken words threatened to overwhelm us. But we didn't shy away from those moments anymore. We faced them not as adversaries, but as two people who had learned how to meet each other in the middle. It was messy, it was imperfect, but it was real. One evening, as I was putting the finishing touches on a painting I'd been working on for weeks, Mark came into the room, his eyes lighting up as he saw the canvas. "Wow," he said, his voice low with appreciation. "That's incredible, Claire," I smiled, setting the brush down. "It's not perfect," I said, laughing softly. "That's the thing," he said, walking over to me. "It doesn't need to be perfect, it's you, and that's what makes it amazing." His words, simple yet profound, settled over me like a blanket. I didn't need to be perfect. Neither of us did. Later that night, as we sat on the couch watching a movie in the dim light of the living room, Mark turned to me, his expression serious. "Claire," he said, his voice steady. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said before, about us finding our way together." I nodded, unsure where this was going. "Yeah." He took a deep breath, his fingers brushing against mine. "I think I've been holding on to a lot of things, trying to control everything, but I'm learning to let go, and I think we're doing this the right way." Tears stung my eyes unbidden. I wasn't sure if they were tears of relief or just a deep, unspoken gratitude, but I knew in that moment that whatever was ahead, we'd face it together. "Me too," I whispered. "I'm trying. And I think we're doing okay." He squeezed my hand, his gaze steady. "We are." And in the quiet of the night, with the weight of everything we had been through still lingering in the air, I believed him. It wasn't about having all the answers, it wasn't about perfection. It was about showing up for each other every single day and choosing to love, imperfectly, messily, but wholeheartedly. And for the first time in a long time, I felt a sense of peace. Not because everything was fixed, but because we were still here, still trying, still moving forward together. That was enough.